Over the past 24 to 48 hours, there has been some intense fighting taking place in the Donbas region of Ukraine, specifically around the settlement of Lyman, as you can see here. Ukrainian forces have attacked this settlement in a couple different directions, apparently with the intent to surround the settlement, but we'll get into that in a moment. First, let's take a look at the map. Now, Ukrainian forces attempted to strike directly into Lyman from the south from two directions. This direction here and this direction here. A couple hours ago, it was reported that these two attacks failed to strike into Lyman. They have been stalled and the Russians were able to repel these attacks. Looking a little bit to the north of Lyman, we have this settlement here, and it was reported that the Ukrainians attacked this settlement and they were able to capture most of the settlement, if not all of it, although I have heard that Russians are still fighting on the outskirts of the settlement, so they haven't captured the whole thing, but the majority of the settlement is in Ukrainian hands as far as we are aware. And it can be assumed that after the Ukrainians fully capture the settlement, they will make a drive down this road and try to capture the settlement of Stavki here. Of course, that's to the rear of Lyman. So zooming out from Lyman and going even further north to this section of the front right up here, we have reports that the Ukrainians were able to strike into this settlement and that they have captured this settlement. And right now, or as a few hours ago, there is fighting going on in these fields between this settlement and this settlement. Now, of course, the goal of the Ukrainians will be to capture this settlement here and perhaps even go further on the other side of this river. Now, zooming all the way out, we can see the attacks in the south. We see the attack north and the attack even further north of Lyman. The two attacks to the north of Lyman were the attacks that were the most successful. The one even further north up here seems to be the one where a major breakthrough has occurred. But like I said, the attacks in the south, the strike into Lyman itself, those attacks seem to have failed. The Russians repelled those attacks. Now we have reports that the Ukrainians are shifting some men and material into the region, namely that they are shifting MLRS systems into this area and they are shifting ground forces into this area beneath this settlement that's held by the Russians. And I think you can take this in one of two ways. One is that the Russians are putting up a stiffer resistance than the Ukrainians expected, so they're shifting these forces in to achieve the breakthroughs they want. Or two, that they had these rocket systems and these men in reserves, and they decided to strategically redeploy them here because they're expecting a breakthrough to occur within the next few days. And of course, I think a breakthrough we could see would be the breakthrough to the north, where they take the settlements to the north, and perhaps even a strike into Yampil, and a breakthrough here, which would effectively encircle Lyman, or at least it would force the Russians to withdraw from Lyman at that point. Now, this is a pretty optimistic projection. This is operating under the assumption that the Russians aren't able to stop the breakthroughs that occurred in the north, and it's assuming that the Russians aren't going to shift reinforcements to the area to stop any further Ukrainian advance, which of course I think they will. And also in the report, it was stated that the ground forces that were moved in down here were part of the territorial defense. And of course, I think it's fairly unlikely that the territorial defense forces are going to be used as an offensive force in the southern region, so I think we can count that out for now. Looking at this optimistically, I think the Ukrainians could be able to push the front line to this river, and of course they would secure this settlement here. I think the grand strategy from the Ukrainian side for this offensive is to of course retake Lyman, and I also believe the Ukrainians are thinking ahead. They're thinking ahead to the winter. They want to establish a more defensible front line before the winter settles in, and of course before the Russian mobilization makes itself known on the front lines in Ukraine in the coming weeks and months. So of course it's in the best interest of the Ukrainian forces to establish themselves either on this river line or even this river line if they are able to capture Lyman itself. This would give them the best chances of holding during the winter months, during the spring months of next year, and the summer months when I believe that a Russian offensive will commence after mobilization has taken effect. Now I'm putting a lot of focus on the Lyman direction. Of course there's other areas of the front where there's some movement, over here towards Lysychansk, and the Russians are still on the outskirts of Bakhmut, trying to take that city as well. And of course, we have the ongoing Kherson offensive. But I am hyper-focusing on Lyman because that's the place that I've seen the most reports come out from. This seems to be a very significant development within the last 24 hours. Now, there's two more topics I'd like to touch on lightly, and that's, of course, today's the 23rd, and that marks the beginning of the referendum voting in the breakaway regions of Ukraine. That is the Kherson region, Zaporozhye region, Donetsk and Luhansk. They are voting to join the Russian Federation. There shouldn't be any illusions. These regions will vote yes to join the Russian Federation. If one or two of these regions did not vote yes to join, that would be a major political blow to Putin. That would be a big blow to the morale of the Russian people. So I'm fairly confident in saying that we will see these regions admitted officially, legally, into the Russian Federation in the near future. And that, of course, gives the Russians the pretext to declare a defensive war against Ukraine if Ukraine were to launch strikes into these regions, offensives into these regions. And up until this point, I've been convinced that this is what the Russians were going for. I've been quite convinced that the Russians were planning on declaring a defensive war against Ukraine, but it seems as though they've already had their excuse to do so because Ukraine has been striking villages in Russia itself for a couple months now, probably since the beginning of the war. So looking at those strikes and looking at the totality of the conflict so far, I'm a little more skeptical that the Russians are going to officially declare war on Ukraine. But it is a possibility, and if it were to happen, it would stem from these referendums taking place and from these territories joining the Russian Federation. Moving on to the next topic, we have the ongoing Russian mobilization, which began 2 days ago. Now, I'm hearing a lot of mixed reporting about this mobilization. I've heard from different sources that it's going well in some regions of Russia and it's going poorly in other regions. But from the totality of these reports, I think it's safe to say this mobilization is disorganized, to say the least, and there are some issues that are cropping up in different regions around Russia. We have the protesters who are arrested and who are being summoned and called up for conscription. We have reports saying that some regions are conscripting people who don't have any military significant experience, which goes against what Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Putin himself have stated. And throughout many regions of Russia, we have reports that their conscription roles are outdated and they're calling up people who should not be called up and they're sending them back. Overall, it's safe to say that it's a little disorganized, and I think it is fair to say that because the Russians haven't mobilized for a number of decades. These systems could be out of date. They definitely have some kinks they need to work out, but it's important to note that this mobilization is not going as smoothly as they would have hoped, so the troops getting to Ukraine, getting to the front lines could take longer than expected. So looking back at everything we talked about today, we have heavy fighting going on in Donbas. We have the referendums beginning today, ending on the 27th. And we have the Russian disorganized mobilization underway as well.